Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob here with Stan. And Stan, this actually in 2024 is the year of the greatest amount of elections globally. So why not have a conversation as it relates to secure elections, something that I think, will be very much resonating for many of the different audience. So Stan, who are we going to be speaking with?
Rob, today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Ben Adida to our show. And Ben is a co-founder and executive director of VotingWorks, and his insights on election security are sought after worldwide. With a PhD from MIT, where he dove deep into cryptography and the nitty-gritty of keeping our votes safe, Ben has been at the forefront of election security for over 2 decades and is a leading voice in the conversation of how we can vote safely and securely. Ben, before we dive into the election system security issue, can you expand on your background and your journey and share anything you think our listeners might be interested in?
Well, you heaped enough praise on me. Thank you. That's very kind. It's great to be here. I would say if you, one thing that maybe helps understand where I come from is I've always been an optimist about technology and cryptography being forces for personal control, autonomy, freedom, and democracy. And so that's really what drives a lot of my work, even when I wasn't always working on voting. I feel like the technology that we're building in the security space can do a lot of good. And in this case, specifically for democracy.
Reminds me of some of the theme or perspective of the old PGP security.
Yeah.
days.
Yeah. I have a lot. I feel I was younger then, but I feel a lot of kinship to that mindset. Yes.
Right. So Ben, discussions about election security are certainly dominating the press, and it covers a wide range of issues, right? From misinformation and campaigns safeguarding the polls themselves, as far as physical security, and each voting cycle seemingly amplifies these concerns every time, right? So, but today we're going to zero in specifically on the aspect of security of voting machines. And so to kick things off, could you sort of guide us through the efforts being made to sort of fortify elections against those concerns around the systems, and what are the critical steps and safeguards currently in place to address those concerns? How do they interlock and help ensure that the process runs smoothly and securely?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's really important to understand when you're thinking about election security or elections in general and how trustworthy they are is it's a particularly complicated problem. And not to poo-poo the complexity of banking or health record security, but in my opinion, this is much more complicated. And it's not obviously so. If you haven't thought about election security, that statement might sound surprising. Why is it so complicated? We're just counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How hard can it be, right? The central issue around election security is the secrecy of the ballot. The ballot has to be secret in such a way that no one else, not the government, not your friends, not your relatives, not your school, not your employer, should know how you voted. And yet, as a group, we need to have confidence that all the votes were tabulated correctly. How do you resolve that? How do you resolve this secrecy but verifiability combination? That's the crux that makes the complexity, and really, frankly, to me, how that makes the whole field so fascinating to try to resolve those issues. So how do we do that? How do we do that? When you think about the act of voting with a secret ballot, you should think about that moment where you're dropping your ballot in the ballot box. Just think about that moment. Right up until that moment, you probably checked in, identified yourself. My name is Ben Adida. You were handed a blank ballot, and then you went off to fill it out. And then at the moment that you drop it in the box is the moment that your ballot and your identity are dissociated, right? We remove the identity from your ballot, and then we keep that data secure. But because we've removed the identity of the voter at that point, now you need to maintain this very strong chain of custody on that ballot box. Because if anything happens to it, extra ballots are stuffed in, ballots are removed, ballot box, explodes on fire. Like, what do? There's no recovery from it, right? Like there's no like, oh, well, we can figure out who it was that, no, we can't figure out who it was that voted. We stripped the identity from those ballots. So you have to think of that pivot point and what comes before and what comes after. What comes before is identifying voters, making sure that everybody only gets to vote once, making sure that you're maintaining the voter list properly and all of that. What comes after is chain of custody of the identified ballot. So there's that handoff. And it's really helpful to think of those
That
before,
does help.
That is right.
the before and the after. And the other aspect that's really important, and this is, I'm talking right now, it's important to note that there's the reality of election security and then and the perception of election security. And I'm going to focus the same way you suggested on the voting machine, the perception of how secure the voting technology is and the reality of how secure it is. And particularly with voting, both of those matter a lot. Like, if you have a system that is in reality very secure, I can give you the mathematical proofs why, everything was done super well, but it is not perceived to be secure by the public. You have a serious problem. Democracy.
If they don't trust.
If the public doesn't trust
the results, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the really, really important concept, which is you need both to build something secure, and then you need to build it in a way that people understand it, that there's enough transparency, that they can build trust in it, and all of that. And so when it comes to the reality of security, the two foundational concepts of election security today are, one, a voter-verifiable paper ballot, and two, post-election audits of how those ballots are counted.
And we've made that transition to paper ballots, seemingly, right? I mean, we sort of strayed from it, but we're sort of coming back to.
That's exactly right. So there are many ways in which we've strayed from it as a country over the last 100 years, 120 years. We've had machines to count votes in the U.S. for a very long time. We had lever machines going back as early as the early 1900s, where there wasn't a paper ballot. There were just levers and counters and whatnot. And by the way, a quick tangent, the reason we have these machines in the US, much more so than other democracies have, is because our ballots are so long and complicated. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. Many other democracies, they just vote on one, maybe two things at a time. We like to vote on, and we like to vote on 47 things. And we also like to vote on different things depending on which side of the street you live on, right? So depending on which water district you're in or congressional district or whatnot. So it's not just that we're voting on 47 different things. It's that you and your next door neighbor might be voting on 45 things in common, but two things differently, right? And the complexity, just the combinatorics of tabulating that is completely unfathomable to do by hand. That's why we have machines, right? So the little tangent, because right now this is turning out to be an issue. There are people who are advocating to go back to hand counting, although we have not been hand counting for a while in this country. And I understand why, I understand why people feel like they feel more trustworthy, people counting ballots and what. It's completely not doable in this country. So that's why we have equipment, and that's why we have the complexity of how we secure this equipment, right? And the way we secure it is by saying, we're going to have paper ballots. And you're absolutely right, Stan. We strayed from that for a little bit, especially in the early 2000s. We went to fully electronic voting machines where you have a touch screen and you'd make your selections, and then you'd get in, congratulations, you voted.
And we had the controversy with Gore. And
yes, but before
yeah,
punch cards. Yeah, you could make the claim that punch cards, punch cards are paper ballots. They're a little harder for the voter to verify that they voted properly, but at least there's sort of a fixed physical representation of the ballot that can't be modified by a software bug, right?
All of us remember the hanging Chad, right?
The hanging
Chad. That's right.
And so you've got so you're right. We strayed from the paper ballots. We're now mostly back to paper ballots everywhere. Not everywhere, but 95%. There's also more vote by mail now than there used to be, which is voting on paper, and that's a good thing. And what does the paper ballot give you? The paper ballot gives you, the voter, the ability to directly see how your vote was recorded. Right? There's nothing mediating that. There's no computer telling you what's in its memory. It's just you looking at the ballot. Parenthetical statement: if you have a visual disability, it gets complicated, right? And it's something that it's important to consider. But for the sake of this narrative, for now, most voters are able to look at their ballot and verify, yes, I marked it correctly. Or if I was aided by a computer to mark it, the computer marked it correctly. it is a paper ballot. I can see it. That's what's really important. I can see it. I can cast it. And then we can maintain a chain of custody on those physical paper ballots. And then we scan them, tabulate them, and we go, why do we trust this scanner? It's just another computer. I'm sure it's really fast and accurate most of the time, but what if it was hacked or what if it was misconfigured? And that's why we run post-election audits, which is roughly a sample of the ballots to make sure that the scanner did its job correctly. So the two fundamental pillars of voting system security today are voter-verifiable paper ballots and post-election audits on the scanned paper ballots.
Very interesting. So let's go a little bit deeper now on the concerns, right, Ben? So there's a lot of concerns around, obviously, security, the trustworthiness. We've been talking about that.
Yeah.
But specifically also the outside influences, those from Russia, other nation states, right? There's serious concerns, right? Public is very much concerned about what influences they have in the outcome of the election. So when you look at those kind of elements, do you have maybe any examples of kind of what you see in that particular area that could help, kind of maybe offset some of the concerns from the public?
Yeah. So I don't have I'm not running around my hair on fire, worried about if Russia is going to hack voting equipment in the next couple of years. I don't think that is their most effective way to mess with our democracy. I think the disinformation route, the confusion route has been much more effective. But where it touches on voting systems, where I think it's really interesting, is where when that disinformation causes confusion in the public's mind as to how voting works. And that confusion can lead to lower trust. And I was talking just earlier about the perception of trust. It can hit that. So my sense is nation states today, their biggest bang for the buck is going to be to attack the perception of voting system security much more than the reality of voting system security. And partly because attacking the reality of voting system security is hard. We don't have the same voting system for everybody in the US. So it's not a monoculture of voting systems that we have, right? So you'd have, and then with paper ballots, you'd have to do a lot of retail attacks locally at precincts and whatnot. So it's not impossible, but it's harder. So the easier route for these attacks are on the perception of it. There's also some concerns that there may be real attacks, not just disinformation attacks, on voter registration systems. That's one of the concerns that's been raised recently and then that would probably look mostly like a denial of service attack, right? Where you're removing people from the polls or whatnot, if it were to happen. We know that in 2016 and 2020, there were attempts to attack voter registration systems. We don't know, we're pretty certain that they didn't go too far, but they were certainly attempts to do that. So when I think about the concerns about nation state attackers, in the short term, I think about disinformation and attacks on the perception of how voting systems are secure. I think a little bit about attacks on voter registration systems. That's what I think about in the short term. I'm not deathly worried, but I do think we're reaching a point where, because we're talking about voting systems all the time, just as you mentioned at the beginning of this, you have to keep in mind, we were not talking about voting systems 15, 16 years ago.
Right.
It was not a story on the news, right? And so what you had at the time is you had mostly election technology was very niche, very small group of people working on it, dedicated people working on it. But the need for public transparency was basically zero because the public wasn't interested, right? There wasn't a lot of public scrutiny. We're in a completely different world in 2024.
To that point, Ben, I mean, as far as the role the federal government plays, I mean, it sounds like previously there was no need for the federal government to step in to help set the bar for voting system security, right? You had all these. It wasn't a visible topic, right? I mean, it wasn't something that was a big concern. So could you go through the backstory a bit about how those standards have evolved over time? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the balance between the federal guidelines and state control in this area, where historically that's where has resided. Where's that dynamic heading?
So the most important thing to keep in mind about U.S. elections is that the federal government mostly doesn't get to tell states how to run their elections. There are some exceptions to that, the Voting Rights Act, notably. But in terms of election technology, the federal government doesn't get to tell states a whole lot about what to do. So it's very much state controlled. However, in the aftermath of the hanging chads in 2000, the federal government did decide to do more. And that was with the Help America Vote Act of 2002. It was a moment where what had been somewhat informal standards on voting systems became a lot more formal with the establishment of the Election Assistance Commission, a new federal agency, the EAC, that established the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, version 1.0, in 2005. They're called voluntary because the federal government can't impose them on states, but the states can voluntarily opt in. And over time, most states have opted in. Not exactly in the same way, and some states have decided to do their own thing. But insofar as we are a divided country, we're actually fairly united around the voluntary voting systems guideline for the most part, right? Most states are abiding by it. And so as we call it, the VVSG version 1 is a 2005 standard. And there's a version 2 of the standard that came out in 2021, which is obviously significantly more up to date on security.
A lot has changed from 2005 to 2021. Yes.
Exactly. Now, the one thing that, initially we were talking about what are my concerns. I don't have like a concern for 2024, but I do have a concern for the medium term of of voting systems, that every voting system on the market today is tested to the 2005 standard.
They're still tested against that old standard.
They're still tested against that old.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And there is some newer equipment than 2005. Like, it's not like it's all dates from then, but it has been tested to the standard from 2005.
But is there a mandate though, Ben, on timing for them to actually get up to the latest standard?
So that is a state-by-state decision, right? The EAC has moved recently. I think they've done a good job of closing the door on new systems certified to VVSG1 and allowing only security updates for systems under VVSG1, thus causing a movement towards VVSG2. But I think it needs to happen a little bit faster. And
somebody needs to put the hammer down and say, it is time to make that transition.
It's time to make that transition. And again, it's going to be a state-by-state decision. And you have to keep in mind that the changes are pretty extensive in terms of security practices, accessibility. There's stricter accessibility standards in VVSG2, stricter security practices in the software itself, right? Because one thing to keep in mind is the paper ballot and the audits that I mentioned at the beginning. They're the pillars of election security, but they're the last line of defense, right? They're the safety net in case everything falls apart. You still have that paper ballot. You still have those audits. You don't want to rely only on the last line of defense, right? In practical security, you build layers of defense.
Right.
And so VVSG2 does a much better job than VVSG1 did of laying out those layers of defense. Systems have to use secure boot. They have to digitally sign assets when they come in and out of the voting system. They have to be not connected to the internet. There's a whole bunch of things that create layers of defense in the technology, even though there's always that paper last line of defense.
So would you say that, Ben, that those are literally again, the new standard is now, they are available for them to take advantage of. There's the timeline for them to get to that point. We all agree it should be faster. But are those kind of some of the key defense mechanisms that you're calling out that, really are looking to make a difference in relieving some of that concern around election security specifically?
I think so. I think that abiding by modern security standards, doing penetration testing, doing vuln scans, which it was not a part of VVSG1, right? It's 2005. It was 2 years before the first iPhone, right? Like, I don't blame them for. There's also lots more to the standard than security. There's functionality, there's accessibility, there's all these other features that have to go into a voting system.
Sure.
So I don't blame. I don't feel bad about the 2005 standard. I just think it's high time that we move systems to the latest version of the standard. And I do think it will address some of the issues that I think will start coming up in the next few years if we don't defend sufficiently against them.
If you paint the picture of kind of what the perfect, or as close to perfect, let's say, right, election kind of security, the voting system in essence would be.
Yeah. Yes.
What's that look like for you?
I think the perfect voting system for me, and others will disagree, but for me is one where all the technology involved is built using modern practices with layers of defense, with secure boot, with digitally signed assets in and out, with penetration testing and vuln scans, and basically ways to have high confidence that the software running on the machine is the correct software. We know that it's impossible to guarantee it, right? Like you can't guarantee that software running on a machine is exactly what you want.
But have high assurance that
but
it
you can have
is
high
functioning
assurance.
the way you expect it to run, and it is
Exactly.
the software you're.
Exactly. And I think VVSG2 makes some really good progress in that direction. And then at a higher level, I think a great voting system is one where a voter has the choice to mark a paper ballot by hand or with the aid of a computer for whatever reason they may choose, because they have arthritis and they don't want to fill 40 bubbles with one hand because they have visual impairments, whatever it is. They have that choice as long as it's a paper ballot, and that ballot gets scanned and tabulated with feedback to the voters so that they can decide, oh, did you mean to overvote in this contest? No, I did not. Okay, you get a chance to go ahead and fix it, right? I think election results should be reported really quickly. And I think there's more progress to be made in how election results are reported today. That's another point where there could be attacks on the system that ultimately are chaos attacks, right? So think about hacking websites of election results. It's going to be discovered. Like we'll know, oh, that's not the result. We'll fix it. But the chaos created if you claim one winner the night of elections and a different one the next day,
Right.
That's a problem, right? So yeah, I think, oh, and let me add one thing that is very close to my heart. I think we need dramatically more transparency around all the technology throughout the technology stack. I was saying earlier, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, most people didn't care. Most people didn't know anything about election systems or election security. And so the technology that was built not in secret, but just like by default secretly. Like it's not, it just wasn't a common practice to do this in the open, right? And as a result, we're left with systems that are ultimately pretty black box in terms of how they function, right? We have these audits and we have paper ballots, and that's really good. But how do these systems actually work? Should I be worried about the fact that the bubble is filled in partially and maybe there's bleed through and all these things that come up in the press? Like
how does it decide? I totally get where you're coming from as far as the need for more transparency. That definitely makes sense to me. But when we talk about opening up voting system platforms,
right,
like making them open source and
yes.
I mean, is there a worry about certain risks, and how do you balance those concerns? I mean, what's your take on mitigating the potential pitfalls of such transparency and openness to those that argue against it?
Absolutely. So I think it's a completely valid concern to raise, right? Like, if you reveal the plans,
right.
If you tell me, give me the blueprint to Fort Knox, like, oh my God, right? That is not how secure systems function. And it's unintuitive, but it goes back a long time, right? To Kirchhoff's principle in lock making and lock picking from more than 100 years ago, which is the idea that the amount you keep secret in the system should be very, very, very small. And the rest, the design of how you secure the system, should be transparent so that it can be peer reviewed and it can be debugged and all of that. Because if you only have 2 or 3 people who know how a system is secured, those people make mistakes. And then eventually other folks figure out the weaknesses in the system, right? And that's been a principle of security for a long time, which is
cryptography, right? I mean,
in cryptography, exactly.
Same approach. Right?
Exactly. The algorithms are public, and they were not always so. The algorithms were secret in the 80s, right? And then in the 90s, and now the algorithms are public, and the keys, of course, are kept secret. Right. So that's the general argument for transparency and security, which I think absolutely applies to voting systems. But there's one more when it comes to super high security systems like voting systems, which is, if you think the nation state attackers don't have the source code to the voting system, you're fooling yourself, right? So you can make that, in other systems that are maybe less high stakes, maybe the attackers don't have the source code. Maybe there was no insider attack, no leak or anything like that. But in voting systems, there's a leak, somebody's got access to the source code. So you might as well have the good folks also have access to the source code so they can try to find weaknesses in it. And there's a couple of other aspects to transparency and specifically open source that really apply here. One, I like to compare it to open kitchens in restaurants, right? You walk into a restaurant and there's an open kitchen. and you can see exactly how they're making the food, if the knives are clean, if they're washing their hands, like that kind of stuff. It raises the bar for how all the chefs behave.
Right.
We're humans. We take shortcuts. It's okay. We're not evil when we do so.
They're on display and they know it.
But they're on display.
It's the Hawthorne effect, right? Everybody, if you know you're being watched, you're going to
Exactly. And as a result, in our system at VotingWorks, everything's open source. Every pull request is public. Every discussion is public. We know, if we take the shortcut right here, which is super tempting, someone's going to see it. And so let's not do that. Let's not take the shortcut. So when you think about software, not just as an end product, but of the process to make the software, doing it in the open kitchen model raises the bar significantly. And that's really important. The second part is public trust. Right now, we go to small towns, town hall meetings, and people are asking about source code of voting machines, right? Which is like an outcome of the 2020 election. And suddenly people are worried about what's in the source code, how does it work, et cetera. It's on the website, literally.
As opposed to having an answer of, it's a black box, I'm not going to share that with you, it's proprietary. I'm sorry, that's how we do our business. I don't want to, you have an answer that can address that concern.
Full transparency, to your point.
Exactly. Absolutely. I want people to know, like, if they're like, how do you decide if a bubble is filled on a bubble ballot that somebody fills in? Well, I can tell you, we look at the timing marks, we draw the lines, we find the intersection, we find the bubble, we count the pixels, and then you can go look at the code. Now, most people won't be able to look at the code and read it, but they can find their preferred expert. They've got a cousin or a colleague or somebody they trust, and they're like, can you look? Is this true? And I think that goes a really long way to building the trust part and the perception part that is critical to election integrity.
Well, those are very valid points on your view on transparency and obviously the approach that you're taking. I wanted to call out one other thing that I think is great work that I guess recently was announced, Ben, that you're doing some great work with DARPA as it relates to helping the military community in voting. So maybe you can kind of explain to the audience some of the work that's happening there and the benefits that's leading to.
Yeah. So we are very lucky to be working on a research project with DARPA specifically to help active deployed military voters successfully cast a ballot. Because when you look at the data on deployed military voters, their ability to successfully get their ballot and cast a ballot is significantly reduced compared to age-controlled populations in the US, right? Sometimes people say, well, most soldiers are 20 years old. 20-year-olds don't vote much anyways. It's not that. But if you even control for that, even if you control for those things, participation is much lower. And intent to participate is not lower. Just the outcome of participation is significantly lower.
Interesting.
And it's not terribly hard to understand why. And to be clear, lots of folks have tried to do lots of things to help, right? We have the Federal Voting Assistance Program, FVAP, which does a lot to make it easier to vote. And they have been making progress over the last few years where you see the voting rates for military voters go up every time. Right. However, there's still a pretty big gap. And the fundamental problem is that it takes a while to get the ballot out to folks in the field, and it takes a while for the ballots to come back. And of course, people immediately jump to, well, let's just give them internet voting. Let's just let them vote from their cell phones wherever they are. And that's got a slew of security issues that make that not a great solution to just jump to. What we're trying to research is whether there's a combination of electronic transfer and paper ballots that can give us the reliability of paper ballots, but the speed of electronics at the same time. Now, there's still a research project, but fundamentally the goal is, can we enfranchise deployed military voters? And then hopefully, because we're enfranchising voters that are in extreme conditions and doing the research to push the security properties of that, hopefully that will be research that can eventually be applied to other settings to continue to secure the ballot in other settings. But that's very, very far into the future.
Well, Ben, it sounds like you're doing some great work, specifically with the military in this case, right? But also generally on helping ensure that our election security is truly secure. But what's your thoughts about this current election cycle that we're in? I mean, what are you thinking about as far as the where we're going to go, and are we going to be able to have? It seems like to some degree there's again going back to your point of trying to undermine trust it's not a nation state. It's perhaps a group within the country that's trying to undermine that trust. And it may not specifically be around the systems themselves this time, the defamation suits that occurred with Dominion, et cetera. I think may have reduced that level of rhetoric by some. But where do you think we're going?
So I think I should start by saying that folks who deny the outcome of the last election are factually incorrect. We have the facts, we have the data, the evidence is overwhelming.
And the court cases, over 60 court cases, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Judges and juries can be wrong, but when we look at the data that we're getting, it seems very clear that the election was decided properly and there were no irregularities of any significance. However, when I talk to folks on the ground in town hall meetings, which I do pretty often, well, not town hall meetings, but I talk to people very often. Sometimes I do town hall meetings. What I can tell you is the folks who are concerned about how the last election was run and who are continuing to say things about it for the next election, they believe it. They mean it. They're not, some of them may be malicious. Maybe some of the folks are using this as an issue to divide Americans, but there's a lot of folks on the ground who are convinced.
Can you persuade them by facts?
It's a really great question, right? And the pessimist will say people are not rational, they're tribal, and so if they've lost trust, they're not going to regain trust. And I think that is probably true. Well, before I even get there, I just want to say, these are our fellow citizens who have lost trust in our elections.
Right.
That's tragic, right?
It is tragic.
It's really it's tragic, and it's something that could be extremely detrimental to our democracy. And I don't want to be a doomer here, but it could be bad.
Yeah.
What do we do about it? I think what we do about it is, to keep harping on the point that matters to me, more and more transparency and engagement and education and explanation, and so that we can convince as many people as possible. And it won't be 100%. It never is going to be 100%, but hopefully it can be more. And I have been in conversations where honestly, there are folks who are just convinced, and you're not going to change their minds. But there's a swath of people who are just hungry for more information. Questions I hear are look, I'm not here to say all technology is bad. I just want to know, what's the error rate on an optical scan precinct scanner? Can somebody just tell me that? That's literally a question I heard at a town hall meeting. Can somebody tell me what is the error rate? So I hear questions like that, and they just, if you give them an answer, they go, okay, so this is a much lower error rate than hand counting ballots. Okay, good to know. They're hungry for that. And there's no evil player in this space. Dominion didn't decide they were going to be secret and flip ballots and whatnot. They just got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the approach we've had in the election technology space that has worked okay so far is no longer good enough for the challenges we face as a democracy. We need a completely different approach that starts with education and transparency and openness and engages with the messiness that is voting, right? There's, like any real world system, there's some messiness. Yes, occasionally there's a voter that's, somebody who's not on the rolls who somehow gets to vote. It's super rare. It doesn't affect the outcome, but it does happen. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why these human processes work that way.
Right.
So I remain an optimist, but not a blind optimist. I think we have to do the work as a community in the elections technology space to educate folks, to help folks understand. And we won't convince everybody, but hopefully we'll convince enough people that we can get back to a world where we're having, conversations. If I can add one anecdote, we've been doing a lot of work in New Hampshire recently, and New Hampshire held what we call the bake-off of voting systems in August. It was our word. It was not their word. We thought it was a fun word.
Yes.
It was last August, 2023 in Concord, New Hampshire. And we went there. It was hundreds of people that showed up from the public, election administrators, et cetera. And we showed off our system, and other vendors showed off their system. And as we walked in, there were protesters, and the protesters had, cardboard placards, et cetera, that said, like, I want my ballot hand. I don't want any machines counting my ballot. So I stopped and chatted with them along with my head of product. And we're supposed to tell us more about what you're thinking. And then, well, machines can be hacked. I don't want my vote to be counted by a machine that can be hacked. And then within a couple minutes, they said, wait, are you the open source voting people? And I said, yes, we are VotingWorks. We are the open source voting people. And they said, well, look, we'd rather not have voting machines, but if we have to have voting machines, it should be an open source voting machine.
Open source. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, we're not the only ones at VotingWorks that can make open source voting machines. Every other vendor can do it too. It's not it's not a proprietary technology. Like, it's an open method, right? But more and more I see some data that shows that it's not like open source voting machines are going to be this magical moment where suddenly everybody agrees and everything is peaceful. But maybe we can have a more rational conversation, just like I had with those protesters, right? With like, well, I still, I can live with your open source voting machine. Great. Let's use that as a foundation to kind of rebuild.
Well, Ben, I mean, you coming on and sharing the aspects of election security helps as an element of education.
I hope
having
so.
those conversations, as you just said, right? Walking down the line as you're going into the bake-off example and having a conversation. And then they're realizing, as you were calling out, and you were very, very much focused on the level of transparency, right, as a key element of building that trustworthiness. So those are all kind of elements of understanding what's really going on behind the scenes to get the kind of, again, the trust back from individuals that have kind of been questioning. So I think this hopefully serves as a platform to also get the message out. For us, I'll say this, it's a great topic. One, obviously, we have not covered in the past. One that's very relevant, especially in the time that we're in this election year. So we're really happy to have had you on. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate the time. And as you can tell, I could probably talk for hours about this. So I appreciate you guiding me on this path too. So thank you.
Hey, Ben, thank you so much. It was very enlightening.
Hello, producer Ben here, and as usual, I've got a listening recommendation for you. You've just heard an episode about elections, and of course, elections lead to governments, and Rob and Stan have delved into that world before when they spoke to Jeff Brown, CISO of the state of Connecticut.
And of course, since we're using taxpayer money, there's that element of just having a transparent program. So we do share a lot of like what we're doing, anything that doesn't really expose, obviously, any security vulnerabilities that might be used against us. But I mean, we really try to run a very transparent program and work with all of the other 50 states because, really what we see is, we're on like Signal together, so we can all like kind of text each other in real time. And it's I have to say, it's really, you don't really feel like you're on your own here.
That was Jeff Brown, CISO of the state of Connecticut, on episode 29, called Digital Government, How the State of Connecticut Has Driven Digital Transformation. Go and give it a listen, and whilst you're there, if you haven't already, subscribe or follow the show.